Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences Bioscience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For today's episode, I'm joined by Professor Roy Sidle, director of the Mountain Societies Research Institute and a professor in Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Central Asia. He joined me to talk about his new bioscience article, Food Security in the High Mountains of Central Asia, a broader perspective. It was a great chat, and I learned quite a bit about the mountains of Central Asia, of course, and also the people who live there and the challenges that they face. With no further ado, let's go straight to the interview. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, James. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Okay, so we'll be chatting about a lot of topics today, but I wanted to start with a quick definition of food insecurity just to sort of, provide a baseline for our understanding.
Let me just kind of turn that around and talk about food security, if that's okay.
Sure.
So food security, at the core of it, ensures that people have adequate and nutritious food for their livelihood support, basically, and that it's available all the time. And we take a look at it from a little bit different perspective, as you're going to see. But the short answer of that is basically what I just said.
Right. And what are the basic challenges in a mountainous region to achieving that sort of food security? We don't have to go too in depth now, but I'm just kind of curious about what are some of the fundamentally underlying issues?
So in mountain areas, you have more complex climate, which we'll talk about a little bit later. You have narrow and sized valleys with very little soil to grow vegetation. And because mountain areas, they constitute maybe something in the order of 27% of the Earth's surface, and they support about 15% of the Earth's people. Those people that live in mountain areas, by and large, are quite impoverished. So this is a huge issue in mountain areas.
Okay, and your work is specifically in the high mountain areas of Central Asia. So can you tell us about some of the potentially unique challenges in those types of areas?
So this is very, very interesting because Central Asia has a kind of gradient of elevations going anywhere from less than 1,000 meters above sea level up to, well, the highest peaks go above 7,000 meters above sea level. So these are really iconic mountains in this area. We have people living at elevations above 4,500 meters, which is quite amazing. Obviously, not a lot of crops are growing up there, if any. In some places, it's mostly dependent on yak grazing. At the lower, so you have this whole stratification going from lower elevation to higher elevation, and the climate associated with those different elevation gradients, the problems in terms of the geomorphology, the problems in terms of hazards in those different areas. So it's a multiplicity, if you will, of different niches that all have their own unique effects on food security.
Just for the record, that 4,500 meters above sea level is, very, very high. I think I personally have rarely been above 4,000 meters, and I was feeling it, the lack of oxygen.
You absolutely do. I mean, I took my wife up there for a trip to this one glacier, and we got to about 4,600 meters, and it wasn't a real steep climb, but it was amazing. It just completely drains your body after hiking about 5 kilometers. So thinking people are living up in that area, and these are tough people that live in these regions.
Yeah, absolutely. And but I would also imagine that the amount of institutional support that one would typically expect from a government, perhaps in a Western country, not present.
Well, it's not present anywhere in Tajikistan, unfortunately, really, but especially in that high elevation area. That's a bit of a political issue too, because the people in this Gorno-Badakhshan area, which constitutes a good part of Tajikistan, but it also is a very sparsely populated part of Tajikistan, are somewhat alienated from the central government. So most of the support that comes into that area comes from outside donor organizations.
And one thing I was curious about is, how much of the food resources in these types of, areas is coming in from the outside versus how much is being, produced or gathered in those spots.
So, a very important question. A lot of the small farms, and they call them kitchen gardens, actually, is the term that's used for these small farms, and they're usually very small. They're on average less than 2 hectares in size. They are the people would actually like to be subsistence farmers, but they can't grow enough food. They typically have big families and they can't grow enough food on these to support themselves. So some of the food is coming in from the outside. And this is a huge issue right now because of costs of fuel escalating, getting food into these areas, the remote areas. There's road blockages in the winter with snow avalanches. We're working on that issue in a separate project. So a lot of challenges getting food into those areas, especially in wintertime and early spring. So yeah, the key is trying to promote more sustainable production on these small farms and getting more production on these farms, but it's a huge challenge.
Yeah, and what is the typical mode of getting resources in and out to the extent that that's unavoidable? Is this a helicopter drop situation? Are there roads
No,
or livestock?
no, it's all by road. It's all by road, and the yeah, you'll see livestock walking along the road, and these roads are really in bad condition in most part. Um, Even the road that goes in the lower elevations all the way up to Dushanbe, which is the capital of Tajikistan. And then if you go in the Afghan side of the Pamirs, it's even worse, as you can imagine. There's roads that are thinly cut into the sides of mountains. They have avalanches, they have landslides, they have debris flows all the time that are closing these roads. They make an effort to get in and ameliorate that. I actually talked about this in a paper that I wrote in 2000 it was published in the journal Sustainability. And it was highlighting this Chinese Belt and Road issue, which I think a lot of people in Tajikistan have lauded this as a possible, savior of getting, economic uh, develop an economic corridor, but they're not looking at a lot of the downside effects of this road because there's going to be a lot of issues with developing these roads and the trails that go off of the roads in terms of natural hazards, which hasn't been thought through at all.
Right. So, I mean, is it simply that the roads will become vulnerable to the same sorts of things that make road building and maintenance in that area difficult?
Exactly, and they're in such remote areas, and the ability of the government to provide road clearance, road repair, and even good road siting, which something I think is very important. The location of the road is it's a very poor situation.
And we've already alluded to it, but these are people who are living and experiencing a high level of poverty.
A high level of poverty, defined by this, what is it, $2.15 a day. A huge percentage of the people are living below that poverty line. So, and this gets kind of unduly burdened upon children who are experiencing malnutrition and stunting. It also gets unduly burdened by women in the area because it's not as prevalent right now because of the Russian war, but before that, and Ukraine, but before that, there was a lot of migration of the male counterparts into Russia to earn additional salaries, and the women were in charge of the farms. So a lot of the burden rests on the women's shoulders, and a lot of the adverse effects get transferred to children.
And this results in systemic malnutrition, where it's a large percentage of the population.
Absolutely, absolutely.
What sort of effects does that have on people? You mentioned stunting.
Stunting. I mean, stunting is just the children don't achieve the height and the body weight that they normally should have. And I think Tajikistan is one of the higher area, at least these rural areas of Tajikistan, one of the higher areas in the world for stunting. So it's a major health problem.
So, you mentioned that some foods are able to be grown there, but I'm curious about, what sorts of things are grown in those, the small gardens, and what's the soil like? What are the challenges like? I'm imagining it's not a warm place.
Well, it there's a gradient. There's a gradient. You go
Sure.
from the lower foothills, which is considered the breadbasket of Tajikistan, and actually that area is fairly food secure. The Most of the agriculture is grown. It's in larger fields there, but then when you start getting above about 2,000 meters elevation, then you start getting into these incised mountain valleys. So in the incised mountain valleys, it's it's amazing country, but you look at the mountainside, and there's a lot of the mountainside. There's no soil on the mountains at all. It's just bedrock. So there's pockets of soil where some trees can grow, possibly, but most of the agriculture is practiced in the valley bottoms. And these valley bottoms are quite constrained because of the deep incision in the mountains. A lot of it's a lot of it is the areas are right next to hill slopes. So you have landslides, you have rockfall, you have debris flow, you have snow avalanches that all impact these small agricultural areas. And then there's usually a stream or river in the valley bottom, of course, and you get periodic flooding from that. Even things like landslides and snow avalanches will periodically block the river and cause flooding as well. So that's another issue. The soils are poorly developed. They have very low organic carbon in them, so the nutrition in the soil is quite poor. The soils are not very well developed. They're young soils for the large part, and a lot of them are colluvial soils. One of the things that we really noticed is in these incised valleys, and again, this is where you're probably in the range of about 1,800 meters above sea level up to maybe close to 3,000, where you see the actual farms and villages developed. A lot of times they're on what we call debris fans. These are geomorphic events that are caused by a big debris flow that's come down through the mountains and deposited this material. And it's some of the only flat land to produce agriculture. So people not only practice agriculture in these areas, but they also build houses, or they put machinery out there, or they have, farm buildings and so on. And it's a very high risk area. Because the next time a debris flow happens, and they happen without warning usually, then that whole area gets reset, and anybody in that area gets pretty much decimated. So it's a lot of the agriculture is in those mid elevation regions, mid to high elevation regions, is practiced on very, very hazardous areas.
Because of it's the constant risk of rockfall, landslides, and I would assume snow avalanches as well.
Snow avalanches and debris flows. The debris flows, a lot of people call them mud flows. I don't like that term, but yeah, debris flows, landslides. Sometimes you have a landslide that'll happen, it'll trigger a debris flow in a channel. So these really high gradient channels that just rush down. And another thing that can happen are glacier related hazards, where you hear a lot about GLOFs, which are glacial lake outburst floods. Those occur very rarely in the Pamir, but what does occur more are debris flows that initiate around glaciers. There was one just near where our university was in Harag in Tajikistan, next to the Afghanistan border, that occurred because of permafrost melting near the terminal moraine of a glacier, and it caused a series of debris flows that basically wiped out this whole village. The not only the agriculture, but all the homes in the village. Luckily, the first debris it was a series of debris flows, and luckily the first one was a small one, and the people had enough sense to get out of the area, so no one was actually killed.
Yeah, it sounds like a very precarious time if you've got large amounts of ice that's above you, and we are in a warming climate. It doesn't sound like a very reassuring situation.
Right, right. And yeah, you talk about climate. I mean, we might maybe we want to get into that a little bit later, but that's another really interesting thing, the climate trajectories in the region.
Yeah, let's actually go ahead and talk about it. What sorts of things are we already seeing, and what sorts of things could be expected?
So I really we're doing quite a bit of work on this. I touched on it in this paper. I didn't go into so much detail, but it's not one of these things. It's not a one size fits all answer when you look at it from the standpoint of mountain communities and their food security. You really have to look at what the climate patterns at a granular scale. And unfortunately, in these high mountain areas, well, most high mountain areas of the world, but especially in developing countries, you don't have good meteorological stations high, at high elevations. So what we've done is taken advantage of the remotely sensed data that's available, recognizing the limitations of that, but also recognizing the benefits of that it gives you a more general footprint of what climate changes or climate trends, I should say, probably because it's only, we only have really reliable data from that from about 20 years. So we see in the western part of the foothills of the Pamirs and like western Tajikistan, we see actually some positive things happening in the last 20 years. More rainfall, and actually warming is not happening that much there, surprisingly enough. So there's not that much warming. So that would actually bode quite well for agriculture, except for potential spring flooding. So that's the one downside. When you get up into the mid elevation range, then it's a different story. It becomes very, very specific. Some of the areas are, all of the areas pretty much from central to eastern Pamir are warming. Some to a great extent down in the Wakhan corridor in Afghanistan. In the central Pamir, there's some areas that are warming a lot. The precipitation pattern is quite complex. In fact, if you look over the glaciated areas, some of the precipitation, and again, it's mostly snow there, is actually increasing quite a bit. So that's a good thing. But that coupled with the warming temperatures is kind of keeping the glaciers at somewhat of a quasi-equilibrium in terms of their mass balance. Not all of them, but quite a few of them.
Yeah, that sounds like there are numerous interacting factors there.
So many.
Yeah. So, what's the water situation like? Since we were just talking about that, does the agriculture that is done, does it have to be irrigated? Does it rain and snow a lot, or is it mostly winter snowpack that then melts? What's kind of the situation?
So the agriculture in Tajikistan it's something like 92% of the agriculture is irrigated. So the reason is the summers are dry all over. They're less dry in western Tajikistan, where I said the breadbasket is. That has the best infrastructure, it has the best access to water, and it has the best climate in terms of delivering water. So then, as you go up in elevation, you tend to get less and less and less precipitation, except for a few anomalous areas like over the Fedchenko Glacier, which is the largest glacier, non-polar glacier in the world. But in general, in areas where food is grown or where pastures are, where livestock are raised, once you get up into the high Pamir and the eastern Pamir, up around close to 4,000 meters above sea level to higher, it's almost an Arctic desert. So it's very, very dry, and the summers get almost we look if we can trust the remote sensing data, we looked at individual months in that period, and there's very few areas that get any measurable precipitation at all. And if it is measurable, it's probably coming as snow, even in the summertime. So that's very interesting. In the mid elevation area, which is where you have all these kitchen gardens and you do have some productive agriculture, although it's stressed, one of the biggest problems there is it's the precipitation is somewhat dominated by snowfall. There's still quite a bit of rain. There's some areas where it looks like you're getting less snow and more rain now, but other areas the other way around. Um, the biggest problem in that region is the year to year variability of the snow water. I mean, we plotted that out in a, I think there's a graph of the precipitation variability over the 20-year period, but we've also done this just for snow, and it's highly variable from year to year. This means this is the biggest source of summer water, early summer water for agriculture. And it means you really need to understand what's happened in that winter and early spring in terms of your snowpack, not just the amount of snow, but the water equivalent of the snow to estimate if you're going to have enough water to irrigate your crops.
So that would be a case in a relatively high snow year. You're not getting the precipitation, but you've got the snow melt that's coming down slope and can be used to irrigate. But if it hasn't been there, if you don't have the water equivalent.
Yeah. Then if you have and I spent 5 winters in Harag in Tajikistan. Each one of those was different. One year we had a really large wet snowpack. Another year we had a very shallow, drier snowpack. Another year we had a late snow that came that was wet, but before that, very little. Each year was different. Each year was different. And if you look at if we look at this remote sensing data, it's incredibly variable from year to year. This, again, it presents a huge challenge for irrigation water supplies, not just in these small communities. These streams feed the two big river systems in that region, the Panch River and the Vashk River, which flow into the Amudarya, which go out through Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan on out to the Aral Sea. So everybody downstream is affected by that, as are the hydropower stations. Tajikistan has two huge hydropower stations, one of the highest head hydropower stations in the world, on the Vashk River. So it has an effect on that as well.
With apologies for the U.S. framing, but it's my frame of reference. Is the variability in the amount of precipitation, similar to what we think about when we think about the Sierras, for instance, having a very high snow year, or is it even greater in this area?
I think it's even greater. I think it's even greater because you'll have years where really there's very, very little snow. Very little snow, and then other years where it's a huge amount, and the water content is variable. Whereas in the Sierras, my sense is that it's a drier snow. Usually, it's just variable. But when you're talking about water release from a snowpack, it's the snow water equivalent. I mean, you can have a snowpack that's a meter deep that has a 10% water content in it, which is not atypical of a high mountain dry region. But in our areas, you can have a snowpack that has maybe 30%. So you get 3 times the amount of water out of that similar depth of snow. So yeah, I would say I've worked in a lot of different areas of the world. I've worked in Alaska, I've worked in Utah, a lot of snowy regions, Japan. I think this area is I wouldn't call it's unique in some ways, but it is very different. It is very different. And the variability, I think, is much greater than other areas that I've seen in the world.
Right. And we've talked about some of the challenges that, the people living in this area are facing. Let's perhaps chat about some of the ways that they might be ameliorated. You lay out in this article, a series of approaches that could be taken to improve the conditions. What sorts of things could be done to address some of these issues?
So I think, the first thing you have to do is look at what you can do and what you can't, what the stressors, I call them, are, or the constraints are, what you can fix and what you can't fix, and everything in between those two. And where, as the saying goes, where you're going to get the best bang for your buck, in terms of supporting these livelihoods for food security. So one of the things, it really, again, depends on the area you're looking at. Let's start in the foothills where you have this larger agriculture. It's not as big of a problem there, but there's some huge issues. One of the issues is that the soils in that region, instead of being shallow like they are up in the mountains, they're very deep, lush soils, silty soils that are wind deposited soils over long, long periods of time. They have very little structure, and they're some of the most productive soils in the country by far. The problem with those soils is that they're very prone to surface erosion, and some of the mismanagement of irrigation that started in the Soviet era has really exacerbated that gully erosion. I've been to some areas in that part of Tajikistan, in those foothills, where I would estimate that 20 to even 25% of wide swaths of land area are unproductive now and in gullies. Some of these gullies are unbelievable. They're many, many, many meters deep. And then you have, when you go up a little further up into the mountains where you have the soft glacial fill, you get down cutting through that. That's a kind of a natural gully. And that is also really, those gullies are huge. Those are some of those gullies are more than 100 meters deep. So that's one problem there. So you can do something in terms of soil and water conservation measures to try to improve agriculture to reduce gully erosion. That's contour farming is one thing. Terracing, I'm not a big advocate of terracing because unless it's on very gentle terrain, because in steeper terrain, it can actually cause landslides to happen. But getting good cover crops on there, even agroforestry in some of the areas, that's going to be a good thing. Getting trees together with agricultural crops. When you get into the mid-elevation region, then we have, the challenges become quite different. There you're looking at these small gardens, and how do you make them more productive, particularly in the summer droughty season. So one of the things that we could do there would be employing a very primitive type of drip irrigation, which is probably most of the irrigation that occurs in Tajikistan, sadly, is very water wasting. It's flood irrigation, and a lot of the water is lost in poorly constructed and leaky channels that get to the agricultural fields. And then on top of that, when it's applied either as flood or furrow irrigation, which is probably one of the most water wasting irrigation methods around. So if you can use something like in the kitchen gardens, like drip irrigation from a gravity fed system that doesn't require pumping energy, that could be one thing. Another thing is trying to reintroduce in some of these degraded lands native vegetation, because actually the people prior to this, and this was another one of the legacies of the Soviet era, I think people got away a little bit from using some of the native vegetation that they had before, that they had depended on, and they had all these, had a lot of subsidies during this period. which they, as soon as the breakup of the Soviet Union, all that went away. And all the infrastructure that was put in for irrigation started to deteriorate. The Tajik government didn't have money to replace it. So thinking, to use native vegetation again, especially in these isolated regions, not only for themselves, but also some of this could be marketed with smart value chain development. So that's, I think that's one. I'm just picking out a few examples. Then when you get up to the high Pamirs above 4,000 meters, one of the things there is heating homes. These people live incredibly tough lives, and what a lot of people are doing are the shrub collection, where they go out. There's this one native shrub that they go out and they completely uproot the shrub and they use that for fuel. That tends to degrade the land. There's different schools of thought on how important that land degradation is, but I think most people would agree it's important. And the other thing there is the overgrazing. Trying to get people to understand that, putting more and more yak, it's mostly yak grazing. So putting more and more yak on these lands is not a good thing. It's going to eventually reduce the grazing capacity of the site, which is really low already, and make some of the areas really unsustainably productive. So I think those are just a few things. There's many, many other things that we could do. From a social side, there's a lot of aspects too that could be addressed.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I was picking up a trend of restoring past practices. Was there a time before, the Soviet Union when these areas were more sustainable? Do we know?
Yeah, that's difficult to say. I've read some of the older works, and there's always been problems in these areas, especially the eastern Pamir, the high elevation. I mean, this area, if you'd ever see this area, I mean, these people have always lived on the cusp of poverty. It's such a tough area, but all of these external pressures had obviously had an effect on it, including the recent ones, including even, the Ukraine war, where extra wheat is not coming into the country. The COVID issue actually caused a lot of monetary issues in terms of devaluation of the currency occurred at the same time. And then on top of all that was the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, which is, I mean, we were living right on the Panj River, and you could look out our living room window and see this little village in Afghanistan. That was a kind of sad way to wake up every morning to see this.
Absolutely, I can only imagine. So we've talked somewhat about the various organizations that have done things with the hope of supporting the people in this area that have been unsuccessful. But I'm wondering now about the donor communities and those who are interested in providing support now. How are they doing? Is it working successfully? Are there more things to be done? What's that landscape like?
So the organization our parent organization is the Aga Khan Development Network, and they're probably one of the more active kind of donor organizations, and although they depend on money coming from like GIZ or the EU, USAID, things like that. We've had projects with all of those that through those networks. So I think, in general, they're trying to do the right thing. I would argue that sometimes they don't have the long-term sustainable vision or a broad enough vision to address some of these things. And this is why I wrote this paper on food security. This is exactly the reason to draw some interest. And interestingly enough, the Aga Khan Development Network, the Aga Khan, they have a lot of different factions to it. The Aga Khan Foundation in Tajikistan really picked up on this and liked it. And they invited me a month ago to the United Nations Water Forum in New York City, where I gave a small presentation at the forum on this whole land degradation issue. So that was, I think, in some ways, I got some good feedback on that. In research, we always have this issue of like, okay, we're out there, we're trying to do things, and there's this disconnect with reality, with the on the ground implementation. We try to break that with our group. We do very applied research in Central Asia. I'm not saying it all gets applied by a long stretch, but I think this is something that has hit a chord, and I think some people are going to start to listen to this. The one thing that I recommended in the paper, at the end of the paper, was trying to develop like an expert system that could actually tease out which of the stressors are more important and other stressors, some of the feedback loops of the stressors that could inform some of the amelioration strategies, planning, mitigation, coping mechanisms, which ones are more important and which ones you can't do anything about. So that hopefully that hits. I'll keep working on that. I'll keep working on that for the next couple of years.
No, that sounds very pragmatic and valuable. I'm wondering, it's sort of a last area to chat about a bit would be, how did you come to be in Tajikistan doing this research? What's the career arc that gets you, 4,500 meters up into the mountains?
Yeah, it definitely wasn't a career arc, I would say. I would say it was a personal decision. I had a very, very nice career. I worked at some of the best universities in the world. I was professor at Kyoto University for quite some time. I was a professor and chair at UBC in Vancouver. And a long career with the government, including, I think I mentioned that I was the director of a national lab for US EPA in Athens, Georgia. I just felt I was working in Australia at the time. I moved around a lot. I was working in Australia at the time, and I just felt like, okay, I've got a few good years left. I'd like to do something. I'd like to give something back. And I'd like to do something at the last part of my career based on my work in mountain environments for most of my career that would benefit these areas. So bringing good science into the area and trying to use that to benefit practice in the region. So that was my goal. It's been almost 5 years now, 4.5 years to 5 years that I've been there. This is probably going to be my last year, but at least as a director of Mountain Societies Research Institute. But I'm happy with what my group has done. They've come a long ways in the time that 4.5 years I've been there.
Well, I would like to thank you for joining me today. This has been fascinating to hear about, and I'm sure our readers have and will continue to enjoy the article. Thank you so much.
Thank you, James.
And that concludes this episode of Bioscience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal Bioscience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.